Hi, everyone. My name is Liz Jansen, and I'm the Executive Director of Women Unite. Today, I have the pleasure of introducing a panel featuring some really incredible leaders from within the Chicago nonprofit and activist community. The panel will be hosted by the one and only L'Oreal Thompson Payton, a soon-to-be published author. So we're all very excited for that. And today's discussion will revolve around what it means to be a Black-led organization, the joys, the challenges, how Black-led organizations have been and continue to be at the forefront of reimagining and redefining how we do things. So I hope you all find this conversation an inspiring addition to our ongoing focus of what it means to put the people back in philanthropy. So I'm going to keep this intro short and hand it off to L'Oreal so we can jump right in.
Thank you, Liz, for such a great introduction. It's really exciting to be back here again with Women Unite on the cusp of the end of Black History Month and the beginning of Women's History Month, and joining all of you today in conversation on what it means to be Black-led organizers and activists in this time in history that is so pivotal is what I was trying to say, and just being in community with one another as well. We'll start by having everyone share their name, the title of your organization, and pronouns, and give us a little bit more information about you and your organization as well. We will start with Kamisha and just kind of go around from there.
Hi, I'm Kamisha Jones. I'm a licensed clinical social worker and the executive director of Sister Afia Community Care, and my pronouns are she and hers. And Sister Afia Community Care focuses on building sustainable mental wellness communities by providing affordable and culturally centered mental wellness care and education. We're a young organization. We've been around for 2 years and do a lot of holistic mental wellness care that centers the experiences of Black women in Chicago.
Beautiful. And I'll go to Jennifer next.
Hey there. My name is Jennifer Pagan. I use she, her pronouns. I am a yoga practitioner, cultural organizer, healing artist, educator, and facilitator. I am also a co-founder and co-director of the Let Us Breathe Collective. The Let Us Breathe Collective is an alliance of artists, activists, educators, and healers organizing through a creative lens to imagine and build a world without police and prisons. The collective operates the Breathing Room Space, Gardens and Farm, which is a Black-led liberation headquarters and oases for arts, organizing, and healing on Chicago's South Side.
Lovely. Thank you for joining us. Eva Maria, pass it over to you.
Hi, my name is Eva Maria Lewis. I am a self-coined sociocultural architect, artist, advocate, and recent college graduate from UPenn. I'm the founder and exec director of the Free Route Operation, which seeks to combat gun violence through a lens of opportunity and compassion. So we basically believe that if we all had the resources that we needed to thrive, then gun violence would not be a part of our communities.
Come on, college grad. You and Megan Thee Stallion, same class. I love to see it. And Janelle, last but not least, tell us a little bit more about you and the Inglewood Arts Collective.
Good morning. I am Janelle Nelson. I am a working graphic designer. I own my own design firm that primarily focuses on collaborating with changemakers and nonprofits, as well as in the creative space as well. But I am a co-founder and the acting director of activations for Inglewood Arts Collective. And Inglewood Arts Collective is a group, a collective of working artists who all have deep ties to the greater Inglewood neighborhood here in Chicago. And we formed really to amplify, connect, and represent positive engagements and interactions, specifically in the greater Inglewood community, but really just a supportive element, part of the ecosystem of all creatives in Chicago and beyond. So yes, I am very excited to be here.
Okay, well, thank you all for joining us today. And now that we know who we're talking to, let's give you a little bit more information on what we're going to be talking about. So according to the let me try this again. Look, I haven't had my coffee, so that's my defense here. Take two. According to the Chronicle of Philanthropy, only 8 to 9% of foundation funding makes it to Black-led organizations. And the unrestricted net assets, or donations that don't have any strings attached, for these organizations are 76% smaller than white-led organizations. Recently, there was a Chicago Sun-Times article in which local activists are calling on Chicago philanthropies to rectify the racial inequity that is severely impacting grassroots community-based organizations, specifically on the city's south and west sides. Across the board, 92% of foundation CEOs are white and 89% of foundation boards are white. So they're white, y'all. Additionally, 90% of all nonprofit executives are white, 90% of board presidents are white, and 84% of board members are white. So essentially, these stats reflect the reality that exists for people who are leading organizations that specifically serve Black people, brown people, people of color. And what we want to acknowledge is that we're trying to shift this reality in the work that everyone shared today and the organizations that they're leading. And it's interesting to note that despite the fact that the racial makeup of a lot of these organizations that the article mentioned, the foundations and board presidents, board members, et cetera, are white, Black people are actually among the highest giving. We give 25% more than white people year after year, and it really is embedded in our community and our history, especially as Black women. I had the privilege last year of speaking to Karen, who is the Fab Giver online, and she talked about Black philanthropy and kind of that everyday philanthropy, right? It goes back to our churches, our communities, our grandmas and their grandmas. We have a history of giving, a history that has been whitewashed and a history that is often overlooked because it doesn't look like the gazillion dollar donations that, you know, Jeff Bezos and his homeboys are often out here giving. So just want to acknowledge the work that is happening on the ground that is very transformational and is really radical in nature because it's going up against all of those stats that we just mentioned. So today's conversation is about the work and how these incredible leaders are making it happen. So we'll start by diving a bit deep into that work, especially work that's focused on the community. It doesn't always align with this is the way a nonprofit is supposed to function, right? We hear it all the time across industries, but in nonprofits especially, that this is the way it's always been done. And oftentimes, because of the gaps that we previously mentioned, those with the most money and decision-making power are completely removed from the communities nonprofits are working with and alongside. So I'd love to hear from you all, if you could give us a little bit more insight into what does it look like for you to transform the work you're doing in contrast to the way the system tells you to do it, and how are you navigating that gap that is written up in here's what the grant application is calling for and what is actually happening in real life. Whoever wants to kick us off, we'll start there and go around and contribute as you see fit. Jennifer, you look like you have something on your mind, so we'll start with you.
Sure, I can get us started. Over at Let Us Breathe, we have made a conscious decision to not be a nonprofit because nonprofit structures work to limit and control liberatory work and movement while maintaining the status quo. And so we actively challenge and operate against the nonprofit industrial complex in ways that are kind of like shown through our work. So our work is rooted in values of anti-capitalism, non-hierarchical, circular, participatory leadership. We believe in like abundance over scarcity. And these values and these practices really allow for us to function outside of existing systems and work to imagine and create new possibilities. And so some examples of that in our work is we really operate from a model of community-centered fundraising. And so that means like we're building relationships with donors and fiscal sponsors and really inviting them into deeper learning and conversation about inequity that go kind of beyond this scope of monetary donation and really aim to address like root causes. And so an example of that is we had a political occupation called Freedom Square back in 2016, which, you know, aimed to kind of bring a spotlight to a lot of the abuse and the torture by the hands of the Chicago Police Department at a facility that they had that is a Black site over on Homan and Fillmore. And in that time, we did not have a bank account. You know, all that we were doing was kind of like grassroots, like fundraising. And so anytime a donor, anytime like media would come to that space, we would say like, hey, if you want to kind of contribute to this cause, if you want to contribute to this space, we ask that you come here directly and that you build relationship directly with like community, and don't kind of just give in a way that is indirect or that is passive, and that you're really engaging like with the liberatory politics that we are building here on this piece of land. And so oftentimes like our structures really center like the community and don't really center funders or their needs or their desires. And so it gives us a lot of power, and a lot of autonomy and agency in the work that we're doing at the Let Us Breathe Collective. And we have really worked to build a structure that operates outside of kind of traditional values and practices that do center donors and that do center funders and their needs. And so, you know, a lot of our work is centered around mutual aid and land reclamation, and it directly challenges and counteracts white nonprofits on the South Side that work to make profit from colonizing land.
I'm just like, yeah, no, keep going. Appreciate it. That is amazing. Thank you so much for sharing. Does anyone else want to weigh on how your organization's pushing against questioning, redefining the status quo of what it means to be a nonprofit?
I'll jump in and segue to the other panelists, because I think, well, I know EAC is not an official nonprofit. So when, you know, it's always interesting to be in these discussions around nonprofits. I mean, and when we grapple with questions like, you know, how are we reacting to or against, you know, we came together organically without considering what is the status quo. And I think our collective group essence is a mirror of how many Black folk individually sometimes navigate the world. Like, if we concerned ourselves entirely through the white gaze, how can we even function, right? So sometimes we move forward doing what feels right to us based off of our own passions and our heart space and our heart work, and doing what feels good and feels appropriate and feels authentic to just the way we want to engage with each other. I mean, we formed really without any intention to formalize beyond just representing. Like, that's literally how we came together. We officially, I guess you could say we officially formed in 2017 and became more activated in the past few years. But we formed because Tonika Johnson was invited to a panel discussion, and she opened it up to friends who also are from Inglewood to combat this narrative that she was the only artist in Inglewood doing anything, you know? And so I guess my response to this question is, not every Black org is constantly concerning themselves, just like how Black people are not concerning themselves with how white folks are doing it or how they say it should be done. You just do it, right? That is not to say you put blinders on, because we are aware of the world in which we live in. And so our organization is at an interesting point right now in our development, and that we are at a critical phase where, particularly this year, we're having more internal discussions around what structure looks like and how do we move forward, because 90% of our actions have been volunteer-based. We just come together whenever we can and engage directly with the community and do some, you know, and placemaking and activations, and just kind of going into an empty lot that we don't know who owns the lot, but we know it's been abandoned since forever. And so we're just going to go here and paint a mural and invite people to come and have music and have the kids come out and create a safe space. And so all of these actions are rooted in heart work. And when we talk about moving forward and fundraising, it is tricky, because now it's like, all right, how does this happen, right? Mutual aid from our own pockets. I have been very much a newbie to the grant writing world, and so that's interesting. Leaning on our own innate talents without going to, I mean, who's good at writing? Who's good at this? You know, we just talk amongst each other and just come together like, you know, this is my age showing, like Voltron, and just kind of doing our best to just make things work. And it's challenging when we start trying to think about bigger engagements, because right now everything is very much get a grant, do the work. Go in our pockets, do the work. Do you have time today? Volunteer your hours to make the work happen. And I think our story, although we're not a nonprofit, there are very similar parallels to how other Black and Brown and Indigenous nonprofits work, because, you know, we just do the work and we figure it out. And we don't always have this like huge macro level support, but we figure it out. that's my 2 cents.
Yeah, to go off that, I started doing this work when I was a teenager, and I was like 18 years old when I went around my block and then a few other blocks with an envelope, like a yellow envelope, and I said, I'm trying to help the elementary school. I'm working with the principal. What do you have? And I was in the beauty salons and the barber shops, and people were like, okay, and they would put some dollars in the envelope and be like, okay, I don't know what you're gonna do, but whatever. And so I was really working like that, with a cognitive belief that nonprofits can be very confining. We have fiscal sponsorship and stuff. And I don't know, like there was always a restriction. So like a gap between what we wanted to do and then what other people were asking of us to do, and like going to people with ideas and going to people with what the community literally has said, okay, I want my money to be used for this, or this is the investment I need. And someone being like, I need you to change that vision on paper, and really just having cognitive dissonance, because I'm like, why is it that I have to sacrifice the work that is needed in my community for this program, or what these dollars, these foundation dollars are going to check off their quantitative needs for the year or their fiscal year. Like they'll say, I'm saying, oh, I want to build a peace room. And they're like, okay, well, we need an after school program. But the school says, oh, we need peace room investment. Why is it that the programming has to take place between 3 and 5 in order for it to be worthy of investment? So Fro wasn't a nonprofit until 2020, just because we got like an obscene amount of money during the protest and we had to put it somewhere. And that was a decision made with a heavy heart, because I had to look at the nonprofit structure. I went to school and I studied nonprofits, and I was like, this is low key for the birds. And I had to look at the structure and be like, instead of working within it, how can I manipulate it so that we can still do what we need to do, and like have a board of directors that isn't going to impose restrictions and making the hard decision to not take restrictive grants and stuff like that. And so kind of like a combination of what Janelle and Jennifer were talking about, just working an organization and leading a team while kind of like hitting the railing through every movement. Because on one hand, like this tax structure can be useful. You get some donations. You have sustainability, not just for yourself, but for your team members. Like when you're a leader, you're responsible for other people that are working with you, but at the same time, not wanting to compromise the foundation of your work. I think I think it's hard. I don't think it's talked about enough. I wish there was a middle ground between like, doing the work and like the nonprofit piece, but I also am hopeful because I feel like my generation is starting to, I don't want to say manipulate because the government, but our generation is starting to like use this system and these tools to do something different without raising alarms. And especially in the climate that we're in right now, it's not being demonized, which I think is very helpful, and something that other people that came before me trying to do some work might not have had the privilege of navigating within.
I love that. I was literally joking with a friend over the weekend about how millennials walk so that Gen Z could run. I mean, at the risk of sounding like a complete fangirl, I am in love with Gen Z and what you all are doing, and learning so much, and appreciate and admire the pushing of the envelope, of the rejection of, well, this is how we've always done it. No, we're going to do things differently. We all have so much to learn from each other, but it's just really amazing to watch, like have a first row seat and be like, you go, like do that. And it's awesome. And Kamisha, I didn't know if you wanted to weigh in before we transition to the next topic. So actually, I'm gonna skip around a little bit. I know it's bad that we have like the order, but because Eva Maria mentioned fiscal sponsorship, I want to touch more on that while we're on the topic. So to give a little bit of definition for the folks at home, fiscal sponsor is a nonprofit organization that provides fiduciary oversight, financial management, and other administrative services to help build the capacity of charitable projects. So they help manage the finances, provide fiscal oversight, nonprofit boards, help with budgeting, et cetera, and also the tax exempt status to organizations, which allows them to accept donations. And so, well, Eva Maria, we'll take it back to you because you alluded to it and also have mentioned predatory fiscal sponsors. So can you talk a little bit more about that and how it's impacted your organization?
Yeah, for sure. So, like I said, we didn't become an actual 501(c)(3) until 2020, but I started this work in 2016 when I was 16, or 2015 when I was 16. And at a certain point, when we were fundraising to help this elementary school that we have a partnership with, they were like, you can't hold this money and not have an LLC or something. So, I'm not going to name any names, but I was a part of youth groups, and the youth groups were like, we can be a fiscal sponsor for you, no problem. And I was really grateful for that. But as the time went on, I found that, there were interest rates or rates of what they would take. So even if we got like a small grant and we needed the entirety of that grant, there were no exceptions. The fiscal sponsor would take a percentage of what we were acquiring, which was little. I was like a teenager, so it wasn't like getting a whole lot, but it was really detrimental what was being taken. And also like having 6 months go by before I could actually touch the funds, or not having any control whatsoever of about what was going on. And a piece of it was ageism. I've talked to other young people who are doing work, and they've encountered the same thing, because people, I won't say it's that they don't trust us with money, but they think they can do a lot to younger people who are trying to do work, and really take advantage of our willingness to do good, and then using that in order to benefit their own narrative and their organization narratives. And I had a couple of predatory fiscal sponsorships, and it was really deterring. I think that's the right word. Maybe, I don't know, but it was like horrible, because I was just getting my toe in. A lot of people were getting our toes in. There's been a huge rise again in youth activism and leadership in the last like 5 to 7, 8 years, 5 to 10, I guess. But a lot of people struggle to sustain their work, because when they do try to reach out for resources, the people that do offer the resources might have some good intentions, but also have some very selfish intentions. And there are no programs to help people, especially young people, sustain their work without having to rely on someone else.
Thank you for that. And Kamisha, I'd love to hear from you kind of on the flip side. Are there ways that being fiscally sponsored has been a benefit, and how it's been a challenge for your organization in particular?
So fiscal sponsorship has its pros and cons. I would say for us as like a young nonprofit, it's allowed me the time to not have all the major responsibility, and for me to learn like, what does it look like for me to have structure and how to operate this nonprofit. And that's been really helpful for me. It's kind of similar to even Maria, we got all this money in 2020 as a result of the uprisings. And so it was like time to make a nonprofit pretty much. And so like having the fiscal sponsorship has allowed us for me to have that time to just learn how to do this, right? Because running a nonprofit, within the confines of what it looks like, there's a lot that you have to pay attention to, and there's a lot you have to be accountable for. So it's happened. That's been one of the things that have been helpful. The percentage is something that I struggle with. I didn't realize that the percentage that we had for our fiscal sponsor that they take, I didn't realize it was a little bit more on the higher end until I talked to some other people. And so, that percentage, cuts into all of, our grant funding and donations. And at the end of the year, I was looking at, our budget, and I was like, oh, we gave them a lot of money. And so, now we're in the process of waiting for our 501(c)(3). And so that's really going to help things. But the percentage I really didn't realize was that high, but I was kind of in a vulnerable position because I needed to, create a nonprofit, and I just had limited time and limited experience. So that's what my experience has been. Like, it hasn't been bad. Our fiscal sponsor is very supportive. It's actually another Black-led organization, and they really do, care about prioritizing, the Black community, and we have values that align. But some things like, I want to be able to do certain things in a certain time, and you can't always do that with a fiscal sponsor. So yeah, that's my experience. Not good, not bad, just kind of meh. in the middle. But there have been some benefits, at least for someone who's really starting something from the ground up and just doesn't know anything about, the nonprofit world.
Thank you. And Jennifer, we'd love to get your take. I know the Let Us Breathe Collective has a different take on fiscal sponsorship. Can you tell us a bit more about that?
Yeah, we actually have I think a very radical and collaborative relationship with our fiscal sponsor that has allowed us to remain outside of the nonprofit structure, even though we are kind of getting larger donations from foundations and individual donors, especially after uprising. It was kind of intense. And so, they've provided us access and connections to bookkeeping, to accountants that can do pro bono work for us, and have really worked to center our leadership and our values and our practices, even in the work that they do. So our fiscal sponsor is Sukasa, and we share a campus with them. So Sukasa is basically a space for Catholic workers. And before, the 2000s, they were primarily housing survivors of domestic violence and Central American refugees. And now have really been grounded in Let Us Breathe leadership and our values and our practices, and are really aligning and supporting us in making that campus a movement building hub. And so, we've supported them in building cooperative structures of governance and different systems of governance that really allow for us to control and directly access our money. And so, I think some of the fiscal sponsorship fees that Kamisha and Eva are talking about, we don't necessarily we obviously have a fee, but it's not predatory in a way that kind of prevents us from doing the work that we want to do, or kind of takes away money from some of the liberatory programming and the work that we're doing on campus. And so I think, it's a very interesting and different partnership. And we have really worked together to steward and activate this campus and invite other organizations and other aligned folks to activate it and make more space for movement.
And something that a few of you have mentioned, and I just want to talk a little bit more about, because it is so big, huge, what has happened in the last few years, the racial uprisings of the summer of 2020. And now fast forwarding to the winter of 2022, what has changed for you and your organization? I mean, there was a lot of interest in Black-led organizations that summer, a lot of outpouring of support financially on social media. And I don't know if you've seen this in your work, that things have kind of trickled down since then, but just curious of what that looks like from then to now. And especially when it comes to, as you said, the sponsorship and the donations that we're pouring in, and what does that look like for you all now? Are people still giving? Why should people continue to give, even though perhaps the spotlight isn't necessarily on Black-led organizations in the Black Lives Matter movement at this present moment, or as much as there should be? I'll say that.
I think there's been more organizations, I guess foundations or even corporations that want to specifically give to Black-led organizations, which was something that you didn't really hear about before, so I think that has been a shift, where before, you would apply maybe to a foundation grant, or, try to engage a corporate donor, and, they weren't really zeroed in and saying, we specifically want to help this community. So I think that's something that I've seen in the nonprofit space, just like with everything, they may start off that way, but what is it going to look like 5 years down the road? What is their plan to make this permanent, right? And so, the article that was mentioned earlier about making these foundations and these other major corporations, this has to be for the long term. This isn't a moment, right? This has to happen and we just deserve it, right? A lot of the organizations that we lead are doing really critical work in our community, and we deserve to have, that ongoing support outside of, a racial reckoning or uprising. So I have seen things be a little bit more targeted, but I also am a little skeptical about how long is this going to last. And then what happens to the organizations that may receive that type of support in this moment, but what happens 5 years from now when that support may go away.
Anyone want to chime in on that or? Okay.
I would add that since then, I feel like there, like Kamisha said, there have been a lot of resources for a lot of Black people who are doing this type of work in terms of corporations and foundations. But I would also say that there has been a surge in people's capacity to volunteer, which has been beneficial. So we have a volunteer accountant who's really dope. And she just does it. Like, she volunteered with us in 2020 during the uprising, and she kept doing it. Our food run, people are volunteer. There's just been like a lot of help with that. And then we even had someone volunteer to help us become a nonprofit and let us use their address downtown as our official address. So I would say like that has been a blessing, just people being more willing to be a part of community and leverage their skills, because a lot of volunteers, when we think about volunteers, we think about people coming and like doing stocking or a delivery, stuff like that. But having people who are willing to be skilled volunteers has been very helpful in allowing us to sustain, even though folks' monetary support has dwindled.
Yeah. It's a great segue too into talking about impact beyond fundraising, with the importance of volunteers, people doing pro bono work, because we know the nonprofit system mirrors capitalism, and we see this most obviously in how nonprofits have to rely on fundraising in order to do their work, and that centers wealth and donors, which inevitably often centers rich old white women, rather than the communities that these organizations are meant to serve. So what are some ways that we can begin to value an organization's impact beyond fundraising and dollars raised, especially when that impact often relies on funding? And Janelle, we'll start with you.
I think impact and sustainability go hand in hand. And in terms of volunteer, you know, I'm thinking about it in two tiers. There's volunteerism in the lane of operational functioning, right? Like just gen ops, like generally just who's checking the email, who's doing this, who's following up with that. I think very often with grants, it's for programming, and it's so challenging to get support for just existing and running. And so having volunteers to help support just social media is huge. And that is primarily relationship based. Listening, I'm jumping around now on the topic, but just listening to everyone talk. I mean, one thread that's rising to me is that we're at a point where we really can define it for ourselves, define all of this for ourselves. In many ways, historically, Black and Brown folks always have been creative in figuring out lanes to make things work. But what's interesting is that I really believe that we're at a point now, as this crescendo of all of this help because of the Black Lives Matter. First of all, Black lives will always matter, regardless of how many eyes are focusing on the movement. And I think we know this innately, and it is shown through our actions. But as we, you know, enter into this, whatever this new phase is, where the attention is kind of sort of dwindling, I think it's important for us to recognize the power that we have within ourselves to define what we need and how we want to do it. I mean, jumping back to the fiscal sponsor question, we heard answers that pretty much cover the spectrum of like not so great experiences, but then also okay experiences, to like what Jennifer's doing, which is just totally redefining the experience. And, you know, EAC, our fiscal sponsor, is one of our co-founders. So we're really blessed and lucky. You know, I'm listening to even Maria's story and my heart was just breaking, because I'm like, I couldn't even imagine going through that. Like, our fiscal sponsor is one of our co-founders, is Folded Math Nonprofit. And so it's one big family, and we have full transparency. And, you know, we share the treasurer and the accountant, and it's just, without realizing it, sometimes we just make it work the way we need it to be. And so when you talk about volunteerism, I think sometimes we move forward and we don't put labels on the things that we do, but yeah, it's like, oh yeah, this is volunteerism because we got so-and-so's auntie to come in and help out for X many hours, right? It is volunteerism because, you know, so-and-so who's a co-founder who does not do this paid has put in like the entire weekend work of building this website or putting together this idea for this mutual aid initiative. I know I'm kind of going all over the place, but basically what I'm saying is when it comes to sustainability, I think it really is up to us to define and be clear on what we need and how we're going to do it. And I think the helpers are out there who want to help. One good thing that's come from us all being on lockdown for these past few years is that we've had to focus and being at home and staring. People have had more access to what we do and what amazing organizations do because there were less distractions, right? So that's kind of a weird positive. It's like, okay, now we have this attention. Let's continue to hold on to this new audience. And folks want to help. It's not hard to find helpers, especially when the work that you're doing is in communities. Like the community comes out to support. So yeah, I just think it's about continuing to show love and keep those folks that's been with you since day one part of the circle, even if that just means communication wise, you know, no matter how much funding comes or doesn't come. So yeah.
Well, as you mentioned sustainability several times in growth and what that looks like for organizations, particularly young organizations as well. So I'm curious to hear from each of you, what does growing in a way that feels good and is responsive to the community you serve look like to you? And does that align with what your funders and donors might expect for you to grow? There's a two-parter there.
I could hop in, kind of trying to maybe join two of the questions that you just asked. I think a lot of our impact is measured through relationships, and it's not necessarily something you can quantify like on a grant report, but it's built through like consistent presence and aligned action. And so I think because of Let Us Breathe's work, because of our values and our practices and a lot of the agency and the autonomy that we have because of our relationship with our fiscal sponsor, we have been able to build much deeper relationships with funders and donors that kind of directly work to counteract these existing systems and allow for us to sustain our work beyond moments of crisis and beyond like moments of urgency. And so donors are supporting us in, you know, building capacity and really act as partners versus like passive contributors. And so they're invested in kind of our long-term work and are supporting us in figuring out what it means to have a staff, right? Figuring out what it means to actually like keep track of our books and our accounts. And, you know, a lot of the system building, instead of, you know, like I mentioned before, centering funders, it really centers the needs of the communities and that we serve. And it really doesn't kind of rely on numbers and like measurements that really don't center the humanity of the people that we're serving. And so I think what sustains us is our relationships and, you know, the connections that we are building with funders and with donors and with our communities, and how all of those relationships kind of work together to create a solid foundation for the revolutionary work that we're doing.
I think that our impacts can be measured through testimony, comfortability, and learnings. So when our constituents tell us that through our programming or through a resource list that we created for them, that they have gotten therapy for the first time in their life, or their kids finally have an after school program and they didn't think that that's something they would have access to. That's a testimony. And then they felt comfortable enough to tell us that, which means that we're cultivating community correctly. And also when we learn enough about them, learn about their geographies, and create tools to learn. Like we created the first community needs and assets assessment for South Shore. And just the fact that we were able to find that over 500 people actually had something to say about what they wanted their community to look like, where the media constantly says that the police or another avenue of force must come in and tell us what we need, but we were able to demonstrate that people actually know what they need. And our ability to collect those voices, compile those voices, and then on our food runs, talk to our constituents and hear about their narratives and inform our work through their narratives. I feel like that is a part of the impacts. And that's more qualitative than quantitative, but I also feel like something that we've been working on when we do apply for grants and communicate with people about why they should invest in our work is writing these narratives and where the numbers might fall short, explaining to people explaining impact to people through stories, through the sustainability of our constituent base. So I'm not adding on to our constituent base right now, but actually cultivating who is there and helping them until they're able to leave that constituent base because they no longer need our services.
Oh, is it okay if I respond? So I, in the programs that we created at Sysafia Community Care, we have 3 programs. Our free therapy program, Thrive in Therapy, and then we have our community care program, which are like groups, wellness classes, workshops, retreats. And then our last program is Developing Mental Wellness Warriors, which focuses on mental health first aid. And so with all of these programs were created based on what Black women told us they needed. And if a funder decides to support that or not, we're still not shifting that. And we really measure our impact in some traditional ways. So quantitatively, like how many people we serve, but we also ask, you know, like when we, at the conclusion of any of our programs or services, we ask, what was your experience like, you know, and they'll rate their overall satisfaction. And we have an 100% recommendation rating. So 100% of the women who come to us and fill out our survey say that they would recommend us to a friend, which shows like community trust, you know. And so those are some of the things that we look at as a way to show our impact. And then when it comes to growth, growing at a rate in a way where it's sustainable. Like my goal isn't for Sister Afia to be this $1 million nonprofit. And $1 million nonprofit isn't more valuable than a nonprofit that has a $50,000 budget or a $100,000 budget. And so sometimes we equate money, you know, as we talked about with capitalism, to value. And so I think when I'm thinking about growth and sustainability for Sister Afia Community Care, I'm thinking about what is the value that we provide to the community and what does the community see value in us. And if that ranges, you know, financially, then it does, you know, from year to year. But, you know, most importantly, the reason why we do this work isn't to get grant money. You know, the reason why we do this work is for the Black women in Chicago. And so just making sure that that's always the central point, because I do think a lot of nonprofits have mission drift, or they're just chasing money, but they're losing why they started. They're losing the essence of, you know, what their nonprofit or their organization means to the community.
Also, what is a nonprofit? I mean, I'm not asking it, I'm saying like rhetorically, like, what is that? Like, what are you doing?
Questions that need answers.
I love that phrase, mission drift. I don't know if that's part of the lexicon of this world, but I'm going to add it to my repertoire now, because yeah, it's like we've been having lots of internal discussions around future and what does sustainability mean. And, you know, we're not a nonprofit. We didn't come to this with the intention of being one. It literally is like, what does it look like when a group of people just want to come together and just do some good shit? I mean, do some good stuff, right? It's like, that's a collective. It's a collective. We're really a collective of friends, but we've been talking about what does this look like in the future, right? Like we're all like old school hip hop generation, and we know that there's so many more people. We do not represent all of Greater Inglewood. We literally represent ourselves, and that's how we started, just to represent and combat the narrative of where we grew up, because we were just so tired of how folks were talking about Inglewood. It's like, this is ridiculous. And so, what does it look like? What does it mean? How can we create avenues for future folks to just come together? How can you be a collective and be supported? How can you come together however you need to come together at whatever frequency and do engagements with the community and still be able to do whatever you're doing, whether you're a muralist, a photographer, or whatever. That's our story, right? And so we've been having discussions. I don't have the answer, Sway, but I do know that that is such a beautiful, juicy, difficult, but tangible thing that we're trying to unpack for future EAC. What does EAC become? We're really interested in not gatekeeping, and I hate the term passing the torch, but amplifying a lane so that others can come in and come together however they see fit to do the work, to do whatever good work makes sense for their where they live and where they're from, and how can they be supported and not have to necessarily be a nonprofit? Or if so, is there a way to be a nonprofit and not be obligated to certain things? So yeah, these are I just answered your question and more questions, but that's where we're at.
That's where we're at, and that's the truth. And I love this group's emphasis on qualitative data versus always emphasizing the quantitative side of it, because I believe that's very much an example of white supremacist culture. I know I saw it in my performance reviews when I did work at nonprofits. It was always about the numbers, the numbers, the numbers. And I was like, well, what about the people and the relationships and the stories, right? There's so much more to it. And it's like, I know you got to have your percentages and everything for the annual report, but that's a piece of paper, right? Or it's a PDF online. What about the people that this is impacting and the work and the actual human lives that are being touched by this? That, to me and to all of you, is what's really important here. And because I like to focus on more Black joy than Black trauma, because there is so much of that in the world, want to know from each of you, how do you find ways to center your work and focus on your work in ways that are life-giving and joyful, despite all of these capitalist pressures, racism, sex, like all the different isms that are out there? How do you continue to center joy in the work that you're doing?
I'll be quick. Joy is an act of resistance in and of itself. And so it is part of the human tapestry of emotions. And you know, Blackness is not solely defined by trauma. I don't have to say that. We all know this. Well, us here know this, right? We center joy because that was our root. We started from a place of joy. Like, we started reacting as a reaction to this other narrative. And it's like, why? No, this is not what our community is. Like, I know that I grew up with so much happiness on my block, right? And it is not an anomaly. And so when we come together, and whether it's so much more than just painting a mural with some kids, it's inviting other orgs to come out and share resources. It's one big familial expression of joy that is not that hard to produce because it's always there. It's not just gunshots, and gunshots aren't even the prevailing thing, although that's what you might hear on the news. You know, joy is imbued throughout Black life. And so we center joy just by amplifying it and just getting out the way and just letting it come through. And if we can be a conduit for showing that, then through art, then, you know, that's where we're at.
I'll talk about my individual joy that I've used, and then I'll talk about like the organization. So for me, part of my joy is like moving at my own pace and not taking on things just because I can, but like being intentional about the things that I dedicate like my time to. And dedicate resources towards. And that really helps me to feel joyful, because I've worked in nonprofits where it feels very constrained. And we know the more people are able to experience freedom, usually the quality of their life, you know, increases as well. So I would say that's what brings me joy. And then as an organization, what brings our team joy is when we see Black women come to us for services and they say, you know, because I came here and received this care from you all, like now I'm feeling better. Now, you know, I have more capacity. Now, you know, I'm able to do some of the things that I was afraid of or were holding me back. And one of the grants that I just applied for, they were like, what is your biggest win to date? And it took me a while to answer that. And I was like, our biggest win to date is that Black women see Cisophic Community Care as a place that they can come to get quality mental wellness care, and that they report that they find healing in this space. And that's the biggest win, you know, not getting, you know, all this money or this and that. And so that brings me joy to even have to report that, right? Like that's our biggest win, and that women find value in what we provide at the organization.
I would say that my joy comes from being in the vision space. The work that we're doing is not precedented. We're all trying to get free, and in the modern age, there is no blueprint for how to do that. And so there's trial and error, and we try and try again, come up with new ideas. Some ideas, you know, not helpful, some ideas are helpful. And being in that vision space with not just other people in leadership positions, but also our constituents, like our constituents coming to us and saying, I have an idea about how you can expand your program, or I have an idea for some virtual programming. Can I help y'all with it? And us, of course, being like, yes, but being so grateful that people are willing to dream with us and create with us and approach this future together. And also just knowing that so many community members long for that future and know that it is possible. And so I think like our ability to communicate, to be together and imagine outside of what colonialism has taught us that we can imagine is a radical act in itself, something that many of our ancestors longed for, not just the ability to do that, but the safety and the space to do that. And so cultivating that space, having those conversations and building tools and going off from that space together in order to create that future. That just brings me joy and also hope and keeps me in the work.
Yeah, I think, you know, in my kind of personal life, a lot of times I center joy by just moving with easeful intention. I think a lot of the culture of organizing and movement building work is kind of rooted in this response to like crisis and urgency, and oftentimes can align with some of the systems that we're trying to like counteract. And so with Let Us Breathe and with the breathing room space, I have been transformed through that work and through that space. It has now been like almost 8 years since I've been a part of that organization, and have completely like developed a healing practice, have really been given space to stand in my power as a leader. And so to see other folks and to see the people that we are serving also be transformed in service of the work, I think is at the root of our joy. And kind of like Eva is alluding to, like activating radical imagination is how we heal, and it is how we connect with our ancestors, and it is how how we sustain the work that we're doing. And so the biggest joy that I think we have is just being able to create a space and a campus that is a site of refuge for people, and that is a model and example of what we can build as a movement and what we do need to move forward.
Love that. And for each of you, if you could say one thing to big foundation funder or major donor who's watching this, or someone sends it to them, that might help them understand your work and the challenges you face and the challenges that they sometimes perpetuate, what would you say if you had the opportunity?
I think I'm trying to think of a compassionate and nurturing way to articulate what I'm trying to say. But I think the best thing that I can say is to actively work to center the leadership and the voices of people who are on the ground doing the work. It is not about your opinions or your values. It is completely about you taking a humble stance and really learning with and aligning and challenging yourself to work to develop a lens that supports the people in being able to do the work that they want to do.
That was very compassionate. Um, yeah, if I had to make a tagline, it would be less reporting, more believing. Um, I say this as someone who, in my other hat, is on the side of helping entities develop those annual reports. I'm the one helping folks design the documents, and then on this other side, I have, just because we've gotten a couple of grants, you know, the reporting on the end of it. And it's like after we do the work and we have this good woosah moment and we feel so good because we just finished this like mutual aid initiative and we had this great event. And now I have to spend a whole weekend trying to pull some numbers and figure out like, and so it's such a, you know, killjoy. So less reporting, more believing, both in the very literal, like logistical, tangible sense, but then also in like the ideological sense. It's like, stop giving money and asking these entities to show and prove. It's like they have attracted your attention because they're already doing the work. So give the money because you believe in them, and then just sit back and observe on your own. It should be less strings. It really should. I think it would be interesting if these big funders hired their own staffing or created their own departments who did the work of observing to create reports, as opposed to putting the burden on the recipients of the funds, because we're already doing the work. So why don't you guys do that? Because you need that information. That would be amazing. So yeah.
If I could say something to a funder or foundation, is to truly build a genuine relationship with Black-led organizations. Like, beyond trying to look good and say that you gave this amount of money or that, like, build a genuine relationship with us. And, you know, I think, you know, out of all the people, you know, foundations or whatever have funded Sister Afia, there's really only two that actively build a relationship with us. They're checking in on us. I mean, we even had a foundation that said, here, we'll give you money to have a retreat to take care of your staff. You know, stuff like that makes a really, really big difference. And so, like, beyond the picking and choosing of who gets what, like, really build relationships with us, because then, you know, it helps not just with our sustainability, but for you to really get a glimpse of like the impact of the work that we do beyond what, like exactly what you're saying, Janelle, what you can just see through some numbers, but you can really, really get an idea. And then I will also say, like I said earlier, like, make a sustainable plan to consistently give to Black-led nonprofits for indefinitely, you know, like, you know, even if there's, you know, a percentage or what have you, but just to make a long-term commitment. I am definitely concerned about like I just feel like it's going to be a short-term commitment as the way a lot of these foundations and funders are acting right now. I want to see a long-term investment. So those are two things that I would, you know, want to say to a funder foundation. And then also, like, I think there's value in, sometimes we forget about like people who give monthly. And I think that like those people are also really, 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 really important because they help to sustain the work unrestricted, you know? And so I do think that like relationships should also really, really be built with those people who are like consistently showing up in whatever ways, whether it's monetarily or not, to support the work. And I feel like that can be a missed group of people when we talk about funders or donors, but I think that they're really, really important to be able to sustain the work that your organization is doing.
All of you sounded so graceful and compassionate. I am not sure that I will what I have to say. But two things I would have to say. The first one is restricted funding is not an indicator of commitment to community. Black and brown people have too much to deal with in this world, too many confines to have to also navigate confines where we're trying to erase and revert the harm that has been done to our communities, likely by the people that are funding us to do this work. we need open grants. We also need to be able to eat. It should not be about dying of starvation. I'm not talking just about food, but energy to do this work. We should also be invested in and be able to experience joy and not worry about where we're going to get some of our resources from in order to do that work. So I would say no restricted funding, invest in leaders to do this work as well, invest directly into community, and just trust that we got it. Like Janelle said, less reporting, more believing. And the second one would be very much so not graceful of a statement, but y'all need to stop donating to these big organizations. They got enough. Like, why, like, stop donating to these 20 million, $50 million organizations. They got enough. When you do that, it's just for the impact report to say you did something. If you really care, give that money to some of the people that don't have that at all, because it would be nice if we could all kind of like hit an equilibrium state. We all have the resources that we need in order to do work in different sectors, and then we wouldn't have the whole church front issue where there's a billion church fronts and the people aren't getting service because everyone has to create their own house because it's so competitive. That is all.
Preach. I think that was still compassionate and eloquent and just all of the things like that they need to hear. So I applaud all of you for telling it like it is. And I hope that they're listening, that this gets into the hands and the inboxes of the people who need to hear it most. And along those same lines, want to hear from you all, what are 3 things, you can't think of 3, that's fine, but just some things that you think need to change in the nonprofit sector to combat this, as Jennifer mentioned earlier, the nonprofit industrial complex.
When you say change, L'Oreal, do you mean within the nonprofits themselves or just as a whole?
I think industry, the sector as a whole, like what are some things that need to change in order to make it better to support organizations such as yourself?
I would say okay. I would say education. I think there are a lot of things that can be inherently restrictive when it comes to creating and sustaining a nonprofit, but there are also ways that you can work around that. But the issue is that a lot of people who create these organizations don't know how to write bylaws, don't know how to curate a board of directors, don't know the best ways that they can manage their money. But if you have those tools, then you might not have to deal with some of the restraints that come with having a nonprofit.
Yeah, I think, I think a lot of foundations or larger donors have to really interrogate how the work that they're doing helps the rich just maintain control over their wealth and of our movements. So I think it involves like private foundations or larger foundations, really figuring out how to go beyond just giving 5% of their money to like nonprofits and to like grassroots organization. It goes beyond like just having like tax deductible, methods of moving through like charities and philanthropies that don't center like folks who are actually doing the work. And I think it also inherently, I think nonprofits and the nonprofit industrial complex thrives off really limiting the amount of political activity that people can engage in and do. And so, I think transforming that system and those laws will really allow for, kind of like Eva and everyone is alluding to, for us to have more freedom to do the work that we want to do, and not have to worry about, board of directors or other folks or funders or donors on our back about kind of, positioning ourselves within these radical frameworks.
And just to quickly elaborate on the 5% rule, Jennifer, that you just mentioned, for folks who may not be familiar with that. So, and feel free to correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe it's that foundations generally only have to give 5% of their net assets every year, correct, to be considered a foundation. So they actually can sit on the vast majority of the money that they have just to have it. It's often in endowments or in sort of the long-term sustainability of the foundation, so they can give forever and ever and ever. But really, it just means that this money is just sitting there and not making it to communities.
Yeah, and oftentimes they invested in like the stock market and like support like the growth of like banks and like financial institutions and systems that are not directly supporting like community.
Ain't that some shit? But Kamisha and Janelle, is there anything you want to add to that? Or wait, Janelle, did you went earlier? I'm not sure. Sorry, it's like really upset about that 5%.
I think that everything that was said thus far are some of the things that I would say need to change, particularly like what Eva was saying about the unrestricted funding. I think it's just so important. Like, I just remember, there was a foundation that I literally had to court almost for almost 6 to 7 months. You know what I'm saying? Like, that type of stuff is ridiculous. And then you get the money, it's restricted, right? So I think sometimes those things, like just like the long wait, I mean, all this, you want to build a relationship, but I mean, that was brutal for me, to keep coming back with a report, like over and over again to prove why we deserve funding. You know what I'm saying? So like stuff like that, I think just needs to go. If you see us, you like the LOI, the application, just give us the money. Stop all the, all the games, or the, back and forth. And I think it goes back to just even thinking about having to constantly prove yourself. And I think that's something that consistently happens in the nonprofit structure. And the way that it is that like, we have to constantly prove why you should invest or why you should support this work. And it's very tiring. So I would love for foundations to be able to put something in place that doesn't involve that, or at least just not to the level that it is. And just to trust us with what we're going to do with the money that's given. And I think having like those program specific ones are okay, but like having to calculate every single thing and, serve X amount of people and all those things. So I would just love for there to just be more trust, in, the organizations that receive funding.
I mean, everyone has said it. I would just be shadowing. I mean, that's pretty much it. It's just more trust. How demoralizing is it to continuously have to prove yourself? Like, no, I'm not doing it. So all of this directly pivots into how and why we're not a nonprofit as of right now. I mean, we're still figuring it out, but it's like, is there a way for these funders to figure out how to support entities without having to prove ourselves? We've attracted your attention for a reason. Like Kamisha said, the LOI sometimes should be enough. A really bomb LOI, not like just one little paragraph statement. It's like, no, here's a great write-up that's one page saying, boom, this is what we're at, and then that should be enough sometimes, right? Google us or look at this link, look at this video, just enough to show the work, and then just let us do the work. Yeah, I'm very much interested in ways that we can support folks whose gifts lie beyond the talents that might and skill sets that might be needed to run a nonprofit. An amazing musician that wants to, I don't know, use music as art therapy with youth in their neighborhood may not be the best grant writer. So, but that work can be powerful and transformative. So, how can we figure out ways to support good efforts without limiting it to staffing needs or traditional modes of communication? Yeah, there has to be a way to streamline that and get around the BS, because there are so many people that want to help in many ways and get so demoralized and it's so daunting, right? That it's like, oh, I can't even. And we're all still just living. We all have life to live too. We have our own individual personal things that we need to navigate. So yeah.
And to end on a high note, I would love for each of you to tell the good people watching at home what they can do to support your work. Kamisha mentioned the monthly donors before. We talked about that too, in the kind of everyday philanthropy, not overlooking those who have 5, 10, 20, whatever dollars it is to give every month, volunteering for organizations as well. But what else can we do to support you all in the work that you're doing?
I can start. Besides giving, which is the obvious, is just sharing our services and our programs with women who need free mental wellness care. So if you go to sisterafia.com/services, we have so many programs that we do each month that are free. All people have to do is either show up virtually or in person. And so just sharing and engaging in that way, also volunteering. We started our volunteer program this year. So engaging with us in that way will also be of great benefit to our community and the organization.
Yeah, I think obviously like donating, I think supports and sustaining and building capacity within our organization and on our campus. So I feel like that information will be given in like the YouTube descriptions, but I think volunteering, like come to the garden and the farm, pick up some tools, like get your feet in and your hands in the ground, and really come through every Tuesday, every Friday, every Sunday. We are active on campus. On Sundays, we do the food run. We have a love fridge on campus. So really just coming through to offer your time and your energy and your labor toward activating a movement building space.
I would say, of course, donating so that we can sustain ourselves as a team, sustain our work, and also hopefully expand some of our programming. I would also say sign up as a skilled volunteer if you have any resources surrounding space or any career attributes that you think could be helpful in helping us to sustain and expand. That would be great as well. And lastly, just having conversations with your community about gun violence, because more people understanding the root causes of it helps our work, in that people see a need for it and people understand why we're doing it, and it doesn't seem so far-fetched to have solutions to gun violence that are not rooted in policing.
I will say start by just following us on Instagram primarily, social media, for any announcements that we'll be doing. We have not really been pitching for donations. Of course, you can donate to EAC through our fiscal sponsor, Folded Map nonprofit. Those donations will directly go towards general operational support, as well as our mutual aid initiative, which we really did a big push for last year thanks to a grant, but we currently don't have funding for that this year beyond a little mini drop that we did last month. So donations go directly to us supporting other creatives on the South Side, particularly within Greater Inglewood. So if you are an artist of any discipline, feel free to join our newsletter and join our network. We are currently working behind the scenes on some community, I'm not going to give too many details away, but some engagement with Greater Inglewood residents. So there will be some volunteer opportunities coming up. So if you follow us on Instagram, whenever we're able to announce that, we are definitely opening our arms to whoever wants to help. But yeah, just on a case-by-case, project-by-project activation level, just pop up and email us and ask how you can support. I'm not going to beg for money just yet. If you got it, if you're willing to give it, we'll take it and we will put it in the pot to funnel it out to other artists. That's where we're at. Yeah.
Great. Well, I want to thank each of you for joining us today, for sharing more about the work you're doing, organizations, why it's important, and I will kick it over to Liz to round us out.
Yeah, thank you all so much for joining this conversation, for taking time out of your days, out of your schedules to be a part of this. I know for me, this was a great way to kick off Monday, gave me a lot of energy, a lot of hope, a lot of ideas for how to start rethinking sort of the nonprofit industrial complex we've been talking about, rethinking philanthropy in ways that really center relationships, communities, and people. So thank you all for that. And of course, as everyone mentioned, to round off this conversation, check out everyone's websites, follow everyone on social media, sign up for the newsletters, make the donations. And again, just continue to stay involved and to rethink how you engage with different communities, different groups, different organizations. How can we all start doing that in ways that go beyond sort of the nonprofit industrial complex, that go beyond sort of what capitalism tells us, what white supremacy tells us? How can we begin to have these meaningful, transformative relationships with one another? So I just want to end that way for all of in our community who have taken time to check out this video. Thank you so much. And of course, we encourage everyone to stay kind, stay generous, and stay radical.